Have you ever wondered that you can still control your autonomous nervous system? So, primarily, autonomous nervous system is consisting of two segments. One is sympathetic nervous system, and other one is parasympathetic nervous system. What does the sympathetic nervous system does? And let's understand this. So, sympathetic nervous system is activated when we feel nervous, when we feel anxious, when we feel something is threatening us, and when we see something that creates fear in us, particularly when we look at the animals like which wild animals like lion, tiger, we tend to frighten from them. So we activate the sympathetic nervous system. And when do we activate the parasympathetic nervous system? When we are in the state of calm, relaxed, and normal life. When we are in a home, comfort situations, we feel the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. Similarly, what are the physiological side when these things are active, particularly a sympathetic nervous system? Let's take what happens when we activate the sympathetic nervous system. When we tend to see something which is threatening, look at the changes that happens in our body, particularly our heart rate increases. Along with that, our lungs starts to take in so much of air inside, and our blood starts to move much more faster, and the hormones like epinephrine or epinephrine gonna be released, and our eyes starts, our pupils start to dilate, so that you can get to see the more range of vision, and our cognitive abilities, that means thinking, ability to think clearly starts to shrink in, and our fear center, which is amygdala, gets activated from this. So this is what the changes would happen when we activate the sympathetic nervous system. So even the opposite is true, like when we activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So what it does, the parasympathetic nervous system just calms down the system, like it slows down the heart rate, and it decreases the heart rate and blood pressure, and along with that it also reduces the rate of respiration, and it decreases the hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine. It also increases the endorphins. And other psychological side is you can get back to your clear vision, and you can start thinking consciously, rationally. You can think about the stimulus. This is what happens when we stay in the state of parasympathetic nervous system. And do we still have control over them? Yes, if you ask me, you still have a control over them. Just by controlling our respiration, we can control both the aspects of autonomous nervous system. So let's dive deep into this. What happens while we breathe in, how we can activate the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, and do we benefit from activating sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, and when to activate, when not to activate. So we're gonna dive deep into that, and we can look at each and underlying mechanisms here. So let's look at when we start breathing in. So what happens now? What are the changes happens in the lungs and heart? Let's look at when we breathe in the air. So diaphragm, the muscle which is beneath the lungs, gonna contract. As it contracts, it provides the so much of space in the chest cavity. As it does, and the veins gonna enlarge, and even the lungs gonna enlarge. Because of that, the pressure inside the lungs as well as the veins drops below the atmospheric pressure. Because of that, the hearts and the lungs starts to suck in the air as well as the blood into the heart as well as the lungs. So this is what happens now. As it does, now what it does, it gonna take in the more amount of blood into the right auricle. And when we comparatively look at the left ventricle and the right heart, significantly there would be less amount of blood in the left ventricle. Because of that, the baroreceptor present in the heart gonna send the signals to the brain, particularly medulla oblongata and pons. So what it does, medulla oblongata will activate the sympathetic nerve. So what it does, it's gonna send the signals to the sympathetic nerves to pass on the heart rate. So what it does now, because the blood in the left ventricle is less, so it has to pump much more harder to supply the blood through the aorta to the different parts of the body. Now what it does, it's gonna just pump harder and harder to supply small amount of blood it has now. So as it does, some other physiological sites, like it can also activate the release of the epinephrine, norepinephrine and cortisols and adrenaline, noradrenaline. These things can gonna be released significantly. And what it does, these hormones gonna convert the glycogen that is stored in the muscles and livers back to glucose. Why do we require glucose? Glucose gonna decompose to produce pyruvate and releases the energy. That energy will be utilized by the muscles and for contraction. As it does, as contraction occurs, we tend to run away from the situations like fight or flight situations, and our pupil dilates. We can get the more range of vision, and our amygdaloid body, particularly that is present in the temporal lobe, makes us more fear. This is what happens when we start breathing in. So it's synonymous that when we start breathing in for longer duration, we tend to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And even the opposite is true, that sometimes when we stay in the state of more excited, more inhalation, we activate the sympathetic nervous system. And let's look at the parasympathetic nervous system. What happens when we activate the parasympathetic nervous system? How we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system? So when we exhale, suppose imagine when we are exhaling, what happens when we exhale, particularly the diaphragm that lies below the lungs gonna relax. As it relaxes, it pushes the lungs upward, and chest cavity decreases. As chest cavity decreases, it applies the pressure on the veins. Because of that, the cross-sectional area of the veins decreases. It supplies a less amount of blood into the left auricle. As it does, now when compared to right auricle and right ventricle, left heart do have so much of blood. So now the baroreceptors present in the heart sends the signals to the brain. This is what is happening in the heart. So again, by assessing these things, medulla oblongata and pons sends back the signal to the to activating the vagus nerve. What it does, it gonna slows down the heart rate, and heart starts to pump a little bit slower compared to for past situations. And because of that, heart starts to go little bit slowly. And more you stay in the state of exhalation, you tend to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So now we have two things in our hand. While we breathe in, we can activate the sympathetic nervous system. While we breathe out, we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system. It's always depends upon what is the duration. More you stay in the state of inhalation, more you activate the sympathetic nervous system. More you stay in the state of exhalation, more you activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And how do we use this knowledge to attain our goals? Particularly, let's take when we wake up in the morning, we are feeling little bit moody, not having any motivation, or something. We cannot focus on something, so we are not alert. So that moment, we want to increase the alertness. What we can do, we can exhale for longer duration, and quickly we can inhale for longer duration and exhale quickly. This one activates a sympathetic nervous system. And when we feel threatened, or when we are overwhelmed by the thoughts and emotions, once we feel fear, we cannot consciously think about the stimulus. So that moment, what we can do, we can still have a control by just exhaling, stay in the state of exhalation for longer duration than the inhalation. So this makes sure that you can control the activation of sympathetic nervous system just by activating the vagus nerve. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And you see these things like when we are going into when we are approaching to something new, it's natural that we tend to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Our heart starts to pump much more harder. At that moment, we consciously quickly take in the breath and slowly give out the exhales. So longer duration you stay in the exhalation, you still activate the parasympathetic nervous system. If you do it for at least 5 to 10 times, you still can get some control over that activation, that fearness and that anxiousness, that nervousness, and still you can get back that rational mind, and you can think consciously after like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. This is what I have experienced, and I think this one information can be helpful for you to go through hardships. And because every time look at this, when we are in a comfort zone we never tend to activate the sympathetic nervous system. But once we get out of the comfort zone, always if we want to grow, so always growth lies outside the comfort zone. So more we stay in the state of state outside the comfort zone, we tend to grow. So outside the comfort zone is also means that you are simply activating the sympathetic nervous system. And how we can get back to normal state? Just by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, just by breath work you can still have control. Just like say quick inhales and longer exhales gonna make you control your thoughts and emotions. Still you can control, get the peaceful mind, and you can be grounded and you can be structured. I think this one information is helpful. Yeah.